The day I came back to Cedar Lake after 4 months surveying a pipeline route in Alaska, my house had a new lock, a new fence, and a sign that read Property of Carrington Shoreline Development. Vanessa Price, the president of the Homeowners Association, stepped off my own porch to greet me, smiling the way people smile when they think they have already won. She told me a man who disappears for months at a time has no business holding the best piece of land on the lake. The association had sold it, she said, to recover unpaid dues. I did not argue with her. I walked back to my truck, opened a waterproof case I had carried through 6 states, and laid the original deed to my land across the hood in front of her. I watched her smile fold in on itself like paper catching fire. I had driven 12 hours straight from the airport rental counter, the truck bed still smelling faintly of diesel and cold Alaskan air, and the last stretch along the lake road was supposed to feel like coming home. Instead, I slowed at the turn where the mailbox used to stand and found gravel freshly graded, a chain-link section bolted where my split-rail fence had leaned for 30 years. And a floodlight mounted on a pole that had never been part of any plan of mine. For a moment, I actually second-guessed the turn, checking the bend in the road against the shape of the ridge behind it, before I understood that nothing about the property had moved. Everything I recognized was simply being erased around the edges, piece by piece, the way water erodes a bank so slowly that no single day looks any different from the last. She recovered fast. Vanessa always did. She said a piece of old paper did not undo a legal foreclosure, and that a man like me, who vanished for seasons at a time and lived behind a house nobody could see from the road, had forfeited the right to be taken seriously. 2 workers in orange vests were already measuring my porch for demolition, marking 3 of my grandfather's oak trees with spray paint. A black SUV pulled up the gravel drive, and a man in a tailored jacket stepped out, introducing himself as Blaine Carrington, the developer who now supposedly owned my shoreline. He told me his crew would begin clearing the lot in 3 days. I looked at the fence, the padlock, the sign, and I did not raise my voice. I simply asked Vanessa which parcel number she believed she had sold, because the one stamped into my deed did not match the one typed on her paperwork, and for just a moment, before she caught herself, I saw the fear underneath the certainty. The security guard standing behind her shifted his weight and glanced at Vanessa as if waiting for permission to do something more than stand there, and I made a point of memorizing his face and the patch on his jacket, because I understood already that every witness in that driveway would matter later. Preston Vale hovered near the mailbox with a clipboard of his own, the kind of man who always seemed to need paperwork in his hands to feel useful, and he told me the board had followed every proper procedure, though when I asked him to name a single one, he suddenly found something urgent to check on his phone. I did not walk toward the house. I did not touch the lock or the fence. I simply stood in the gravel with the lake behind me, catching the last orange light on the water the way it always had at that hour, and let the silence stretch long enough that even Vanessa seemed to notice how little I intended to give her. 6 months earlier, none of this had a name yet. Vanessa had shown up at my door on a Saturday morning, clipboard in hand, informing me that every property around the lake was expected to fall in line with what she called a unified community image. I told her politely that my land was not part of Cedar Lake Preserve at all, that it had been carved out of an old farm tract back in 1959, decades before her subdivision existed. I even handed her a photocopy of the deed's first page. She barely glanced at it before asking what a man who fixed his own roof and drove a truck older than her youngest board member could possibly understand about land law. I explained that my driveway was private, that I had my own well, that I hauled my own trash, and that the boathouse and dock had never been part of any association agreement. She looked past me at the peeling paint on my porch rail and said the cabin was dragging down property values on the nicest stretch of water in the county. Then came the offer. Carrington wanted the shoreline, she said, and she could arrange a fair price if I sold before things got complicated. The number she named was less than half of what any appraiser would have given the land, and I told her no. She said something then that I never forgot, about how men who inherit things tend to overvalue them because they never had to build anything themselves. 2 weeks later, the first fine arrived in the mail, a notice for an association I had never joined, and I wrote back explaining, again, that I was not a member. She never answered that letter directly. Instead, she started asking around the neighborhood exactly when I was leaving for Alaska and how long the contract would keep me away, and at the time, I mistook it for nosiness instead of planning. Looking back, I could see the exact moment the tone between us changed, though at the time I mistook it for nothing more than an ordinary disagreement between neighbors. Vanessa had stood on my porch that Saturday with a folder of glossy community newsletters, pointing out the manicured lawns 2 lots over as though they were something I should aspire to, and when I mentioned that my grandfather had built the boathouse before the county even paved the access road, she smiled the particular smile of someone who had already decided the conversation was over. She asked whether I planned to keep living out here alone once I got older, whether I had ever considered how a property like mine would look sitting empty if something happened to me on one of my trips. I told her I appreciated the concern, though we both understood it was not concern at all. It was an inventory, and I had just watched her take it. Wade Ellison, who had managed my grandfather's boathouse back when the lake still had more pine trees than driveways, agreed to check on the house every week while I was gone. For the first month, everything looked normal in his photographs, the grass cut, the gutters clear, the dock lines coiled the way I always left them. By the second month, association security had started turning him away at the gate, telling him the property had been taken over by the HOA for the community's protection. Wade kept his camera anyway, and 2 weeks before the foreclosure sale, he caught Vanessa, her deputy Preston Vale, and Blaine Carrington standing together in front of my darkened windows, pointing at the shoreline like men measuring a stage before a show. Sitting across from my attorney, Sloan Barrett, I finally saw the shape of what had been built while I was gone. The association claimed I owed more than $118,000, a figure assembled from 8 years of retroactive membership dues, road maintenance charges, absentee owner penalties, dock noncompliance fines, inspection fees, and enough accumulated interest and attorney costs to make the number sound almost official. Several of the penalties had been dated for days when Wade's photographs proved I was home, cutting the grass myself. One fine, for failing to maintain the lawn, had been issued on a day when 3 feet of snow covered the entire property. Every notice had gone to addresses I no longer used: a closed post office box, an office mailbox in Alaska I never checked personally, and finally the house itself, where security had already changed the locks on my own mailbox before the first hearing was even scheduled. Sloan spread the fine schedule across her conference table and walked me through it line by line, tapping each entry with the end of her pen as though she wanted me to feel the weight of every fabricated charge before we moved to the next one. $28,800 in retroactive membership dues going back 8 years, though I had never once received an invoice during any of those years. $19,000 for road maintenance on a private easement road the association had never touched, let alone paved or plowed. $24,000 in penalties for an absentee owner, despite Wade's dated photographs showing the porch light burning and the grass trimmed within an inch of code on nearly every week in question. $12,000 for a dock the association claimed violated a design standard that, as it turned out, had never been adopted by any recorded vote of the board. Sloan set the pen down after that one and simply looked at me the way a person looks at another person once they both realize the same thing at the same moment. The certified mail receipts were the strangest part. Each one bore a signature reading O. Halbrook in handwriting that was not mine, on dates when I was thousands of miles away with no possible route home. Sloan suspected someone inside the association office had been signing for me, which meant the entire paper trail proving proper notice had been fabricated from the start. There had been no hearing where I could contest the charges, no public notice of the sale beyond a closed-door executive session the board held without posting an agenda. The only bidder at that sale, unsurprisingly, was Carrington Shoreline Development, and the price they paid was a fraction of what the land was worth on any honest appraisal. What made my stomach turn was the money trail underneath it. A payment of $150,000 had moved from Carrington's account into something called Price Community Solutions, a consulting company registered, according to the state filing, to Vanessa herself. This was never about protecting property values or keeping the neighborhood tidy. She had turned her position on the board into a pipeline for delivering my shoreline to a developer, and she had been paid personally to make it happen. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling less like a man who had lost a house and more like a man who had walked into the middle of someone else's quiet theft. The deed itself told a story that went back further than any of them understood. It had been recorded in 1959, decades before Cedar Lake Preserve existed as anything more than open pasture between the old county farm and my grandfather, Everett Halbrook. The description ran off stone markers, an ancient oak, and the natural waterline rather than any survey grid, and it granted clear, independent ownership of 428 feet of shoreline, along with a private easement road out to the county highway. Nowhere in that document, or in any document since, had a Halbrook ever signed the land into an association that would not exist for another 4 decades. Nadine Keller, who had worked the county land records office longer than most of the board members had been alive, pulled the original filings for us without taking sides in the dispute. She confirmed what I already suspected, that Halbrook Point had never been annexed into Cedar Lake Preserve, that no merger document appeared in the chain of title before 1990, and that whatever had gone into Vanessa's foreclosure file did not match the parcel my family had owned for 3 generations. The county's digital tax map, it turned out, blurred the boundary lines between my land and the neighboring lot, an error anyone glancing at a screen instead of the actual recorded plat could easily mistake for a single property. Vanessa had been given the real deed 6 months before the sale. That single fact turned a careless mapping error into something else entirely. I spent the better part of an evening with the deed spread flat under a desk lamp, tracing each boundary call with my finger the way my grandfather had taught me to read a survey when I was barely tall enough to see over his workbench. The description ran from a granite marker at the old fence corner along the natural line of the water to a second stone beneath the largest oak on the property, and every point on that page still existed exactly where the surveyor had left it more than 6 decades earlier. I laid a current tax map beside it and watched the mismatch resolve itself almost immediately, the county's digital boundary line running crooked through the middle of my own living room. A rendering error that any clerk cross-checking the actual recorded plat would have caught in minutes. It was not hard to find. It was only hard to find if nobody had bothered to look, and Vanessa, holding a copy of the real deed in her own hands 6 months before the sale, had clearly decided not to. Buried in the appendix of that same 1959 deed was the detail that would eventually turn the entire fight around. A 36-foot corridor running from what would later become the clubhouse down to the community dock sat squarely inside the boundaries of Halbrook Point. My grandfather had granted the original association a revocable license to use that corridor decades earlier, on the condition that they never claim ownership of it, never obstruct his access, and never transfer the right to use it to anyone outside the community. By selling my land to Carrington, the association had violated every one of those conditions at once. Sloan put it plainly. Vanessa had not just sold the wrong house. She had handed me, without meaning to, the legal key to whether Cedar Lake Preserve kept its only walking path down to the water. I had that leverage sitting in my hands, and I did not use it right away. Cutting off the corridor overnight would have punished hundreds of families who had no idea what their board president had done in a closed session, and that was never who I wanted to be. Instead, Sloan filed for an emergency order halting the demolition, sent formal notice to Carrington that ownership was in dispute, and demanded the association preserve every email and financial record connected to the sale. I sent one more letter, quieter than the others, informing the board that the license for the shoreline corridor was under review pending the outcome of the ownership dispute, without stating outright that I intended to close it. Blaine Carrington called me himself 2 days later, his voice smooth in the way men get when they are used to being believed. He told me an old deed would never hold up against a completed transaction and offered me a modest settlement to walk away quietly. I asked him why a company so confident in its position would offer money to a man he claimed had no legal standing at all. He hung up without answering, which told me more than any lawyer's letter could have. Vanessa, for her part, sent an email blast to the entire neighborhood painting me as a bitter absentee owner who had let his property rot and only reappeared once land values climbed high enough to notice. Marjorie Flint, the association treasurer, reached out to me quietly not long after that email went out. A retired auditor with decades of experience reading ledgers other people hoped no one would ever check, she told me Vanessa was planning a grand unveiling of the Carrington project at the clubhouse, complete with architectural renderings of a restaurant called Price Landing, standing exactly where my house currently sat. The date of that celebration, as it turned out, would land on the very same day a judge finally granted me the temporary order allowing me back onto my own property. The clubhouse was strung with white lights and catering tables when I walked in, a rendering of a 3-story glass restaurant projected on the wall where my grandfather's cabin should have been. Vanessa stood on a small stage beside Blaine and Preston, telling the crowd the association had cleared away an aging, deteriorating property to make way for the community's future. Security moved to block the door when they saw me, until Sloan reminded them, loudly enough for the room to hear, that obstructing me now would violate a standing court order. The room went quiet as I walked to the front and set the deed on the table beside the architectural model, the old ink and county seal looking almost out of place among the glossy renderings. Vanessa recovered her composure fast, telling the crowd that men like to hold on to old paperwork to feel important. I asked her 3 questions instead of arguing. I asked which document gave the association ownership of Halbrook Point, who had signed the merger paperwork on my grandfather's behalf, and how that signature appeared on a document dated 3 years after he had died. She did not answer any of them directly, insisting her attorneys had handled the transaction properly and that I was only delaying the inevitable. I read the court order aloud, halting all construction, barring Carrington from altering the property and restoring my access to the house, then asked the board to schedule a full public meeting with complete financial records. Before I left the stage, I told the room that the next meeting would not decide who owned my house. It would decide whether the clubhouse kept its only legal path down to the water. The backlash came fast. Vanessa fired off an emergency newsletter, accusing me of threatening to lock the entire community out of the lake, of trying to tank home values out of spite, of wanting to bankrupt the association through frivolous lawsuits. A handful of neighbors showed up at my gate demanding an explanation, and I gave them one, laying the deed and the court order across my tailgate for anyone to read. I told them plainly that I had not closed the corridor, that I had only asked the board to stop claiming ownership of land it never held. Marjorie's financial records, once she finally released them, showed the association had spent $96,000 on legal fees defending the sale, another $42,000 changing locks and clearing my property, while pocketing $610,000 from Carrington, $150,000 of which had flowed straight into Vanessa's private consulting company. One neighbor, an older man named Harold, who had lived on the lake longer than the association itself had existed, told me flatly at my gate that he did not care whose name was on which piece of paper, only that the water stayed open for his grandchildren every summer. I understood that instinct better than he probably realized, and I told him so, explaining that the corridor closure was a last resort I hoped never to use, not a threat I intended to carry out against people who had nothing to do with Vanessa's arrangement. He studied the deed for a long moment, running a thumb along the raised county seal, the way older men sometimes do with things they want to trust, but have learned not to trust too quickly, and by the time he handed it back to me, his posture had changed from suspicion to something closer to embarrassment on the association's behalf. Preston tried to defend the board by suggesting that women in leadership had been left to clean up after an irresponsible man who abandoned his own house, a line that fell apart the moment I produced Wade's photographs proving the lawn had never once gone untended. Then came an email Marjorie found buried in the shared account, Vanessa writing to Blaine months before the sale that I would be in Alaska through the end of the month, and that they only needed to finish the transaction before I made it home. A second email, worse than the first, showed she had specifically instructed her attorney to keep my original deed out of the foreclosure file entirely. What had looked like a careless mapping mistake was, in black and white, a decision made with full knowledge of what she was hiding. The public meeting that followed drew more residents than the clubhouse had chairs for. Vanessa took her usual seat at the head of the table, insisting my deed was outdated and that modern tax maps had superseded whatever a 1959 document claimed. An independent surveyor I had hired projected a fresh set of measurements onto the screen, showing Halbrook Point sitting entirely outside the boundaries of Cedar Lake Preserve, with the parcel actually named in the foreclosure, a narrow strip labeled Lot 47B, sitting well to the north of my property line. Nadine confirmed, once more, for the full room, that no transaction in the county's records had ever moved Halbrook Point into the association's hands. Sloan then projected the merger document Vanessa had relied on, zooming in on the signature until the crowd could read it clearly. Everett Halbrook, dated 3 full years after his death certificate had been filed with the same county office. Vanessa tried calling it a clerical error, until I read her own email aloud, the one instructing her attorney to keep the real deed out of the sale paperwork. A murmur moved through the crowd when the surveyor overlaid the corridor boundary directly onto a photograph of the clubhouse patio, and I watched several residents lean forward in their chairs as if trying to physically place themselves closer to the truth of it. One woman near the back asked aloud whether that meant the association had been charging boat storage fees on a strip of land it never owned, and Marjorie, still holding her folder of financial records, confirmed quietly that yes, for at least the last 4 years, those fees had gone straight into the general operating account without anyone questioning where the underlying easement actually came from. Then the surveyor walked through the corridor itself, showing the paved path from the clubhouse, the staircase down to the dock, the card access checkpoint, and part of the observation deck, all of it sitting on land that belonged to my family. I told the room the license had been violated the moment the association claimed ownership, transferred rights to Carrington, and blocked my access to my own property, though I still had not moved to revoke it outright. Vanessa sneered that I would never actually close the path, certain the whole neighborhood would turn against me if I did. I told her I did not need to punish an entire community to prove she had sold something that was never hers to sell. Blaine stood up from the back of the room and, in front of everyone, demanded Vanessa return the full $610,000 his company had paid within the week. She did not step down quietly. In the days that followed, Vanessa argued the association had used the corridor long enough to claim its own ownership by continuous use, that my absence had justified the board stepping in to protect an abandoned property, and that a decades-old deed carried no weight against a modern tax map. Sloan picked each claim apart in turn, pointing out that a license granted by agreement could never ripen into adverse ownership, that Wade's photographs already disproved any claim of abandonment, and that a tax map had never once been recognized as a substitute for a recorded deed. When Marjorie discovered someone had quietly altered an old set of board meeting minutes to suggest my grandfather had verbally agreed to join the association. Decades earlier, she produced the untouched original she had saved years before, and the forgery collapsed as fast as it had appeared. Preston began distancing himself from Vanessa almost overnight, insisting to anyone who would listen that he had simply followed her lead without ever reviewing the underlying paperwork himself. Blaine's company filed its own suit against the association for misrepresenting clear title, and the HOA's insurer sent a letter warning that any claim tied to intentional misconduct might not be covered at all. Vanessa kept drawing on association funds to hire private counsel anyway, prompting residents to demand a recall vote, which she delayed for as long as her position allowed. In the middle of all this, Carrington sent a crew back to the property, claiming they still retained inspection rights, and I called the county sheriff and produced the standing court order until the crew left without further incident. During those weeks I kept working, because a survey contract in another county did not pause itself simply because my own property had turned into a courtroom battle. I would drive out before dawn with a thermos of coffee and a folder of association records riding on the passenger seat, running elevation lines through someone else's timberland, while Sloan's paralegal called with updates on subpoenas and document requests. It struck me more than once how strange it was to spend my working hours proving other people's boundaries were exactly where the old surveys said they would be, while fighting at home to establish the same simple fact about my own land. Wade told me once, half joking, that I had become the only man he knew who got paid to do for strangers what he was doing for free in his own backyard, and he was not entirely wrong. Standing outside my fence line afterward, Vanessa told me I had only won because I understood how to manipulate paperwork better than she did. I told her she'd had 6 months to read one deed correctly and chosen instead to look away from it. Sloan filed a full countersuit on my behalf, seeking to void the sale, quiet the title once and for all, and recover damages for trespass, fraud, document forgery, interference with property rights, and every legal fee the fight had cost me. When the court finally ordered Vanessa to produce the original signed merger document, all she could offer was a PDF file created 3 days before the foreclosure sale had ever taken place. Judge Rosalind Keene walked through the full chain of title from 1959 to the present day without rushing a single page of it. Nadine testified again that my deed had been properly recorded and never once challenged or superseded in county records. The surveyor laid out the boundary description, the surviving stone markers, and the shoreline measurements that matched the original document precisely, confirming once more that Halbrook Point and Lot 47B had never been the same parcel. The association's own counsel admitted Vanessa had relied entirely on internal files prepared by a management company rather than verifying the county's official records herself, and Sloan entered the email proving I had handed Vanessa the real deed 6 months before any of this began. I watched Vanessa's face while the county clerk read the death certificate date into the record, and for the first time since I had walked back onto my own driveway months earlier, she looked less like a woman in control of a room and more like someone doing arithmetic she desperately wished would come out differently. Sloane did not raise her voice or reach for theatrics. She simply laid the two documents side by side on the projector, the death certificate on the left and the merger signature on the right, and let 3 years of calendar sit between them in silence, long enough for every juror-adjacent face in that gallery to do the subtraction themselves. The forged merger document fell apart the moment the judge examined the signature date against the death certificate on file, and the notary listed on the page denied under oath ever certifying it. Blaine admitted under questioning that Carrington had known the sale carried real risk, but had trusted Vanessa's assurance that I would not return home in time to object. Vanessa tried once more to frame everything as an act of good faith on behalf of the community, until the judge asked her, evenly, what community benefit came from routing $150,000 into a company that bore her own name. She had no answer for that question, and the silence that followed said more than any argument could have. Judge Keene took a recess before delivering her decision, and I remember sitting on a hard wooden bench in the hallway outside her courtroom, Sloane beside me reviewing notes she no longer really needed, while Vanessa's attorney paced near the water fountain, with his phone pressed to his ear. Blaine sat by himself on the opposite bench, arms crossed, staring at the floor tiles, as though he could already see the number his company was about to lose stamped into them. When the bailiff finally called us back inside, the room felt smaller than it had that morning. Every chair filled, every conversation reduced to the particular silence that settles over people, waiting to hear whether the version of events they built their case on will hold. The ruling, when it came, left little room for interpretation. The court found the association had never held any right to manage Halbrook Point, that every fine and fee assessed against the property was void from the start, that the foreclosure sale itself was invalid, and that the quitclaim deed to Carrington had transferred nothing at all because the association had nothing to give. Ownership was confirmed, cleanly and permanently, in my name, with the association and Carrington jointly ordered to cover restoration costs, legal fees, and reasonable damages, while the forged documents were referred for further investigation by the appropriate authorities. The court additionally recognized my right to revoke the shoreline corridor license given the association's repeated breach of its original conditions. Judge Keene closed her ruling with a line I still hear sometimes on quiet mornings by the water, that an association cannot sell another person's property simply because that person was not there to object. Within days, the board received formal notice that unless a fair agreement was reached with me inside of 30 days, the corridor down to the community dock would be closed for good. Residents wasted little time calling for a recall vote, and Marjorie laid the full damage out in plain figures: $610,000 owed back to Carrington, more than $200,000 in legal costs, restoration expenses for my property, and the very real risk of losing lake access altogether. Vanessa insisted, right up until the vote, that every bit of this had started with my own selfishness, so I read the settlement I had offered before the trial ever began: the return of my house, cancellation of every fine, an independent audit, an end to the Carrington contract, and full transparency in the board's records. She had rejected every part of it. Marjorie stood up near the end of that meeting and said something I did not expect from a woman who had spent months quietly passing me documents in parking lots rather than confronting Vanessa directly. She told the room she had stayed silent longer than she was proud of, not because she believed the sale was right, but because she had watched what happened to other board members who questioned Vanessa's decisions in the past. how they were slowly frozen out of committees or quietly replaced before their terms even ended. Her voice shook slightly as she said it, though she did not stop, and by the time she finished, several other residents were nodding along with an expression that looked less like agreement and more like relief that someone had finally said it out loud. Preston voted for her removal, along with almost everyone else in the room, choosing to save himself rather than stand beside her any longer. Vanessa lost her position by an overwhelming margin, and her consulting company was ordered to return every dollar it had collected from the sale. Carrington quietly walked away from the Price Landing project altogether. The new board approached me not long after, asking whether I would still allow the shoreline corridor to remain open, and I agreed, on my own terms this time, requiring the association to formally acknowledge my ownership, promise never to expand construction on the path, cover their own maintenance and insurance, leave my private driveway untouched, and direct a portion of any usage fee toward keeping the lake clean for everyone who depended on it. Drafting those new terms with the incoming board took longer than the trial itself in some ways, because I insisted on language that could never again be twisted the way the old license had been twisted. Sloan and I sat across from 3 new board members for most of an afternoon, walking through each clause line by line, making sure the corridor agreement named the boundary by coordinate rather than by any tax map that could someday be redrawn by mistake or by design. I asked for an annual walkthrough where a neutral surveyor would confirm. Nothing had crept past the original 36 feet, and the board agreed without argument, still shaken enough by everything that had come before to welcome any measure that kept the arrangement honest. By the time we signed, the agreement ran 4 pages longer than the one my grandfather had handed over on a single sheet decades earlier, though I suppose that is simply what happens once trust has to be rebuilt out of paper instead of a handshake. I never closed that doc. Most of the neighborhood came to understand, slowly, that I had never wanted to take the lake away from them in the first place. The person who had put it at risk was standing right there in front of them the whole time. Before she left the clubhouse for the last time, Vanessa turned to me and asked if I really believed one old piece of paper made me someone worth taking seriously. I told her it never needed to make me important. It only proved she had never actually had the right to treat me like I wasn't. She opened her mouth as if to answer, then seemed to think better of it. And for the first time since I had known her, Vanessa Price walked away from a room without having the last word. Preston lingered by the door a moment longer, offering me an awkward nod that I did not return, since an apology after the fact never quite settles a debt built on months of certified letters sent to addresses he knew I would never see. Marjorie shook my hand on her way out and told me she planned to run for the board seat Vanessa had just vacated, adding with a small, tired smile that someone in that room ought to actually read the documents before signing them from now on. I told her I thought that sounded like exactly the right qualification for the job. 3 months later, the house stood whole again. Carrington's crew came back on their own dime to replace the lock they had installed, rehang the wooden door they had pulled off its hinges, move the fence back to where it belonged, and repair the oaks their workers had scarred with spray paint and stakes. I hung the old wooden sign back over the gate myself, the same weathered letters my grandfather had carved. Halbrook Point, established 1959. The original deed went into a safe deposit box at the bank in town, and a certified copy now hangs framed in my study, close enough that I see it every morning before I leave for work. The new board pays its corridor fee on time, the community dock stays open the way it always has, and Wade still shows up most Sunday mornings for coffee on the porch, the way he has since before I could legally drive. Marjorie won her seat on the board that spring, and one of her first acts was requiring every future financial disclosure to be posted publicly rather than buried inside a closed session nobody outside the room ever saw. Some mornings I still walk the corridor down to the community dock just to check the boundary markers. Wade and I reset after the survey, more out of habit than necessity, since the paperwork protecting them now sits recorded and unshakable at the county office. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me during the worst of the dispute nod now when they pass, a few of them stopping to ask how the repairs on the boathouse turned out, as if the whole ordeal had simply been bad weather that eventually cleared. I do not hold it against them. Most of them never saw the closed-door vote, or the falsified signature, or the wire transfer into a company bearing Vanessa's own name, and it was never their fault that a woman they trusted with a clipboard had decided their community's shoreline was worth more to her than the truth. I sit out on that dock some evenings and let the water settle flat and quiet the way it does just before dusk. Only a handful of months ago, Vanessa stood on that same porch and told me a man like me had no right to hold on to the best piece of shoreline on the lake. She believed my absence meant I had given something up, that a man who traveled for work had somehow forfeited his claim to the place he came home to. But ownership does not evaporate just because the person who holds it happens to be somewhere else for a season. Vanessa had a board behind her, a hired attorney, private security, and a developer with deep pockets standing at her shoulder. I came home with nothing but an old truck and a deed signed before her association ever existed, and in the end, that single piece of paper was the only thing the house ever needed to remember exactly who it belonged to.